Welcome to the podcast series Advancing Racial Justice in Education. This series was developed as part of the Lorentz Workshop Week on Institutional Racism in Dutch Basic Education. In this second episode, my guests and I will talk about the role of statistics and related technologies in either addressing or erasing race and racism in education. Welcome, everybody. My name is Judy Mesman. I'm a professor at Leiden University in the area of societal justice, and I do mostly research on education and parenting and larger systems in relation to racism and racial injustice in the Netherlands. I have two guests today who are part of the Lorentz Workshop on Advancing Racial Justice in Education in the Netherlands, and I will ask them to introduce themselves. Claire first.
Hi, thank you for having us. My name is Claire Crawford from the University of Cambridge. I'm an assistant professor in education policy and practice. I have particular interests in educational administrative data in a way to kind of understand the structuring of education and to bring about sort of greater equity in education. Thanks.
Thank you. Khaled?
Thank you, Claire and Judy. So my name is Khaled Tamimy. I'm the CEO and founder of Social Technology Lab. In short, we're a tech startup focusing on technology for social justice. But the slightly broader answer to the question what we do is that most people working on societally relevant questions, the big questions of today, they need to rely on technology that they often don't own, don't understand, and don't control. And so they lose a bit of sovereignty there. And we try to tackle that issue by developing technology that social impact makers actually own, understand, and control.
Cool. So thank you for being here. We've had a whole week of talking about many aspects of institutional racism in Dutch education. Yesterday, we taped a podcast episode about knowledges about racism. So multiple ways of engaging with the topic as researchers, but also from different perspectives. And I think one of the knowledges that is mostly used by policymakers comes from statistical data, comes from big data, comes from quantitative information that they use to base their decisions on when it comes to education. We've also discussed what some of the drawbacks and limitations are of those data. And Claire gave a really inspiring keynote about this topic yesterday. And maybe you can point out some of the main messages to start off with around the issues of quantitative data to make decisions about education in relation to racial justice.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think the key message that a lot of kind of crit scholars, so scholars that are interested in kind of critical approaches to quantitative methodologies, is really trying to problematize the relationship, the really unhelpful often relationship between how different types of research are perceived, how qualitative research is sometimes dismissed as partisan or anecdotal, whereas quantitative research is more often than not held up as a kind of gold standard or a very robust or rigorous way of understanding a problem. And I think that whilst qualitative researchers are very good at understanding the relationships between themselves and sort of paradigmatic or frameworks, we encourage them to think about their positionality. We encourage them to think about how they, as part of data collection, kind of have a hand in, if you like, understanding and analysing and representing data. It is not uncommon for quantitative scholars to not engage in that kind of same reflexive work. They don't often think about themselves as who they are and how their sort of position may well influence the sort of approach that they might take to understanding education phenomena. And so I think our biggest challenge to the field is that can we create more socially just understandings of education data by really getting quantitative researchers to engage with the processes that happen often before, and can we expect to see in research the same kind of scrutiny of tools, of justifications of use of those tools, and how those tools best respond to a phenomena, for example, that is under study. I don't know if you want me to continue. Or...
Well, no, that's a very good introduction to exactly
Yes.
the type of problems we want to discuss today. And I think, Khaled, in your company, you encounter similar questions and challenges. Can you say how this plays a role in what you do?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm not a quantitative critical race theorist, but I think there is definitely some similarity to what we call philosophy of technology or data ethics. And I very much recognize what you just sketched, Judy. So there's this huge power disbalance in the use of data. And you have this famous quote that in my company we often use a lot, which says you have lies, damned lies, and statistics. And the point of this quote is that statistics don't tell a story by themselves, but it's the researcher who uses that data that tells and decides what story is being told. And so that very much aligns with what Claire is saying. On the kind of more concrete end of things, that means that you really need to ask who is being empowered by certain statistics, by certain data, who's being empowered by a certain technology, and who gets to decide where the use cases of this technology are. And what we see in the industry here in the Netherlands is that the conversation about these questions is coming up. So you have a few of these impact assessments that kind of force you to think about these questions. But this so far has mostly been a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach, where technologies often, and database technologies often still used as a very plug-and-play solution rather than a very thought-through process.
Yeah. So statistics, a version of lies, potentially, right? Depending on who uses it and how they use it. But yet, something you often hear, and I think I've also seen in titles of papers, like the data speak for themselves, is something that you hear a lot. Like, oh, look, these are the figures. So now we know what's going on. Claire, I know you are critical of that type of framing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that we seem to be, and there's a lot of scholars that will speak to kind of a notion of policy by number, that societal problems are being increasingly constituted through number and understood through number. And more often not, where there are sort of commissions, they tend to be very short, sharp calls for information, calls for support. And that engenders a climate where researchers with expertise in quants very quickly kind of dip in and out of data to give policymakers a sense of a problem. And I think that the availability of data, I think one of the things that a lot of the quant crit scholars will point out is that we're living in an increasingly datafied world and that we are almost constituting children as data points. Rather than seeing the whole child in education. We spoke a little bit yesterday, Judy, you helped me to understand these sort of apps now that parents have to look at child's homework and attendance, and it seems Capita sort of really big data companies, data tech companies that sit over these sorts of things. I can't remember what the equivalent in the Netherlands was, I'm sorry.
Here it's Magister.
Okay. And so we're beginning to amass an enormous amount of data on children. And I think that we need to be really careful that we don't draw kind of causal understandings of problems based on these data points alone. Because whilst you may be able to show a pattern, you might be able to show a trend, you might be able to show an increase or a decrease in X, actually it tells you nothing about the problem. And I think in the lecture that we had here yesterday was a kind of really crude qual-quant, just a diagram that said, you know, it was an image of children using a help desk, and it said, well, only 4% of children have actually engaged in this help desk. So the conclusion might be, we don't need it because the children don't want it. On the opposite side was a kind of qualitative inquiry over the same sort of help desk that said, actually, children were not approaching the help desk because of reasons to include not feeling, you know, confident, or it didn't seem as the right avenue for them to. And so we need to be really, really careful about how we understand education data, how we understand trends in that data, and how they inform our understandings of a problem, completely devoid of the voices of which we are speaking to. And I think that's a really central point. I think policymakers need to be actually both. There is such strength in both ways of understanding phenomena. That would be sort of one of the things that we would advocate for.
Yeah, and I think policymakers as well as organizations and institutions often don't know what exactly they're asking for. They think they have a pretty straightforward question. I wonder how you deal with that with clients, Khaled, that I'm sure come up to you and say, this is what I want to know, and they think you can just come up with whatever, or I want this technology. How do you explain to them this issue of
This is exactly where, for example, these impact assessments come in play, and so especially nowadays with the revolutions in technology that are happening as we speak, almost everything is buildable. Almost everything that you have a question about, you can kind of build something around that gives you insight in it. And so it becomes way more important. The difficulty doesn't lie in building anymore, but it lies in deciding what to build. And so the importance of frameworks that allow you to proactively think about what is it I'm actually trying to answer, and is technology or data-based technology a means to that end, or is it just a fancy kind of a code I put around it? It's becoming more and more and more important. And so we also see this with our clients. And so one of these approaches that we often take in doing this is a different kind of design methodologies that also force you to think about where in this design process is technology serving one of those kind of variables.
Yeah. So, and when it comes specifically to education, can you give an example of where data are clouding our vision?
Yeah, and again, so I think this comes back to the challenge of quantitative researchers, for example, and it's about challenging how they may come to understand a problem. And quant crits speak quite a lot to the idea of watching out for categories, watching out for whether data is in aggregate form or whether it's in disaggregate form, and actually what can be lost in the analysis or what can be lost about our understanding of problems when we look at those two things. They're also quite mindful of the use and misuse of data. And whilst it is not, like QuantCrit would not advocate that people, are inherently misuse of data because they may not understand the kind of the difference between a aggregate and a disaggregated analysis, they may quickly lean to a better story, if you like. And I think that one of the things that they would talk about is both the statistical treatment. When you subject data to statistical treatment, what falls away? An example of this might be that where you kind of create regression models that account for different types of things, account for perhaps single parentness or areas of economic deprivation in their analysis, may well not address the problem as to why do we have minoritized communities living disproportionately in areas of poverty. And so I think we need to be really, really careful where we apply analysis on what falls away when we subject data. What is the difference between raw data? What is the difference between data that's undergone statistical analysis? And have a really honest conversation actually with what the relative merit is of adopting either of those analyses, or actually whether we should be presenting both and trying to understand both and communicate both.
Because I think that sort of control variable approach can do a few things. One of them is making potential institutional racism invisible by saying, oh, it's not race, it's not, it is actually socioeconomic background, it's poverty, but obviously poverty has a color in most Western societies in Europe.
And I think there's a good example in the UK of a report that was an inquiry into school exclusions, the level at which children are excluded or permanently excluded from schools. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent language of that is. But we know that in Britain that children who are black and male are excluded at higher numbers. We also know that there's disproportionate exclusion of those that you would class as Romani or Gypsy or Irish travellers. But when you read the kind of report, the outcome of the investigation, it didn't appear that stark, and it was quite difficult to understand what we knew to be true as education researchers, what had happened to that data. And actually, if you dig deep into the technical report, you get to understand the logics of this kind of statistical methods that were applied. And in the case of Irish and Gypsy sort of travellers, Romani traveller community children, moving around in multiple created data instability. And so the justification of those who'd moved in multiples, they were removed from the data due to data instability and data insecurity. And that explains the sudden drop from being kind of 5 times more likely than a white British student to be excluded to being less than likely than a white British student. And so, some people might say, well, it was buried very deep within a technical report to make it difficult to understand and to, intentionally mislead. Though others may have uncritically said, well, that is data unstable. And when you have data instability, you need to do something to that because we're schooled in a particular type of, statistical knowledging around how we perform statistical work. And both of those things can be simultaneously true. But I just think it's an interesting example of what you just said.
And you refer to how we're being schooled. That is quite important, right? As researchers, how we are educated to think in a certain way about our role and the role of data and our treatment of it and our supposed objectivity. Now, you are trained as a
mathematical physicist.
Exactly. I was wondering about the order of those two words.
Math and physics.
Yes, math and physics, but you call yourself a sociologist at heart.
Yes.
So can you speak a little bit to how that training but being interested in more social sciences does in relation to how we are trained to think about data and numbers and facts?
Right. Yes, I can definitely reflect on that. I think it's also a product of the time I've been trained in, where you are seeing these common denominators across sciences. I once had this analysis that historically the sciences came from a common ancestor in a way. Like you could have one thinker that crossed disciplines in their thinking. And as we moved kind of through modern times, we have very much segregated sciences into different silos or disciplines into different silos. And what I've seen as I grew up as a professional, as an academic, well, I'm not an academic, but as I went through my academic schooling, I saw where historically there was this divergence. The sciences were now converging again, or at least the different disciplines were coming back in something that we call complex systems thinking. And that's where I think kind of my trained as a mathematical physicist, but a sociologist at heart really comes at play, because many of these methodologies that come in play in this idea of complex systems thinking find their application in disciplines like psychology, economics, and sociology. And what I find particularly interesting about that in the context of social justice work or education is that different from historical statistics or quantitative science, it really leaves room for this qualitative study of things through a mathematical lens. So it's kind of dequantifying math and taking a more qualitative approach to it as well. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's definitely at least my roots to calling myself a mathematical physicist, but a sociologist at heart. But I also wanted to reflect on something Claire said, because especially in the educational context, I think that's one of the essential things that we overlook. And we coined this at my company as the AI diversity paradox. And actually, it's more of a statistics and diversity paradox. And it relates to this idea that almost everywhere where you do quantitative science, where you do statistics, where you do data-based investigation, you're always pushing things towards the mean. Whereas diversity is really about understanding the margins and the variance of things. And so there's this inherent paradox in using quantitative science and database technology whenever you're in a context where the variance, where the diversity is actually what you're interested in. And this forces us to think about how can we use mathematical ways of thinking to questions like these in a different manner. And that's where the qualitative kind of math comes in play, which I find particularly very interesting.
It sounds very interesting. I've reflected on this when I teach as well, with when we call something evidence-based. Yeah. There's this wonderful article in Dutch by, I think it's Marit Hopman, and it's called evidence-based, but in Dutch, based is written as the other word for animal, the Dutch word for animal, right? Evidence-based, B-E-E-S-T. And she reflects really also on this idea of when something is evidence-based, when do we consider something to be evidence? And I show the students this sort of typical regression scatter plot thing with a line through it, right? And then this is the correlation, and you can say, see, if you do A, then kids will be more B, so that's great, so we should do A. But of course, the scatter plot will show data points that diverge significantly from the regression line. And then the question is, who are those people? And they might be very well the minoritized, marginalized communities that do not benefit from A to promote B. But this is not something that is generally taught in, say, first, second year statistics classes. So I'm sure you have examples, Claire, of this type of issue of calling something evidence-based in education in relation to race when it sort of isn't.
Yeah, there are some funny jokes about evidence-based policy. I'm really sorry, I've got a weak voice today.
That's all right.
There are some jokes about sort of evidence-based policy making, or actually, are we in an era where it's policy-based evidence making and very specific calls? It's like asking, if you seek, you find. I'm going to ask a particular question because in the end, I want the response to come back in the way that I envisage the problem to be. Yeah. And so whilst I'm really keen for research to respond to policy calls for evidence, actually sometimes it's about not responding to that question as is, but actually retraining the question. I think in stats, there are obviously some very good and robust and right reasons to suppress some sorts of data. And those trained in statistics will know that you cannot leave people identifiable. And that's right. And that's right. And that's just, you do not want to alienate a single child of perhaps a Sikh origin in a particular school because they become visible in the data. The question then is not about not looking at the experiences of Sikh children in an education system, but about how much bigger we needed to make the cohort so that they can still be included, as opposed to sort of minoritizing. And it's the same for sort of Gypsy, Roma and Chavrala children, where you have small numbers of children, perhaps those that are seeking refugee or asylum status. We're encouraged to not look in a way because the numbers are so small, but it almost leads to marginalisation of those that are already highly marginalised in the system. And on the opposite end of the scale, we might, as you know, statistical kind of, not look at billionaires, or not look at those outliers, not look at the most wealthy person in the street. And so I think one of the big tenets for QuantCrit is very much numbers for social justice. We should not be doing anything that is not socially just, but if there are socially just reasons for kind of looking into those margins, then we should find ways that are methodologically robust and protective and not playing into any sort of deficit or remarginalising, but we shouldn't also shy away from those because they sit at those sorts of margins. And actually, some of the biggest traumas in and around the education system are in those ultimate margins. And so it's about ethical research. It's about approaching these problems ethically. And I think that, again, it comes down to that kind of who gets to be a problem in the first place? How do we even constitute the problem? How is the problem understood? And it might be that those at the most margins aren't even a policy problem because they're almost invisibilised in the systems of which we study. And I think that is a call to research of both qualitative and quantitative. And actually just spending the week here has been wonderful in terms of looking at the multiple different ways in which people are trying to understand those problems. And I think there is great strength in these different disciplines. And actually it is more often than not a call for us to work together for a more of a sociologically informed quantitative analysis of problems, but also how do we kind of make quantitative work more sociological and more critical and so I think it's a beauty of kind of multidisciplinary and truly mixed method research. I think that would be one of the biggest things I've taken away.
Yeah, thanks, great. And I'm sure you have examples as well of how that plays out into your daily practices in thinking about invisible groups, right, and the ethics of choosing what data and what technologies to use where and how when it comes maybe also to youth.
Yeah. But first I want to focus for one tiny second on the use of ethics in the context of this conversation, because maybe great, to social justice scholars, this is something that is trivial to be named in this context, but for a tech professional, rarely do you see these things coming together. And that's, I believe, the connection where I said in the introduction, I'm not a quant crit, but there is a huge overlap between quant crit and what I call tech philosophy. And that is this idea that technology and data is not neutral. And if you agree on that fact that it's not neutral, then it starts to make sense to talk about ethics and what values do you want to drive forward with that technology. So I appreciate talking about that in this context, particularly about the role of invisibility. Maybe before I reflect about our work in the educational context here in the Netherlands, what we know from cases historically is what we call proxies in data science. And this is this idea you might even give an algorithm an instruction not to take race into account, but just like there are biomarkers around and you can kind of scan someone's data from cells they leave around at a table, in the digital world, you also leave behind a lot of these markers that allow people to be traced back. And so what we saw historically was this case, and there are many instances of similar cases, but we had this case in the United States where there was an algorithm being used for mortgages. And it was instructed not to use race as a variable. But it didn't take long for it to still include race in a slightly invisible way, because it's understood that postal code might be actually a very good proxy for race, because unfortunately we segregate in urban areas. So this is really also stressing again that this invisibility is maybe a hoax. And I think in the past few decades it was already a hoax, but as we are moving in the age of AI, this is just becoming more and more a hoax. AI will definitely find traces like these and will be able to trace people back. And so it's becoming more and more important that we safeguard these aspects.
Sorry, just to cut in. I guess this is my biggest fear for these big data companies that are datafying children. We think that those uses are within schools and for the benefit of making sure that schools are accountable, and this language of, like monitoring for good, like making sure that children are accountable, they're progressing, they're achieving outcomes. But my fear is, just as you said, these sort of data points, what else can they be used for? Is this going to be early access to mortgages? Is this going to play into the idea of profiling certain children that have maybe got more behaviour points, with everything we know sociologically about stereotyping and behaviourism and the disproportionate impacts that have on both gender and race and other sort of groups? And at the moment, there doesn't appear to be any clear regulation or accountability around how, we are kind of almost sleepwalking into this kind of datafication of children, and we don't really know how and which ways these large databases are going to be used into sort of the other mechanisms you mentioned. Sorry, just to
No, I think it's a great addition. It's absolutely, this is the commodification of human traits and behavior, and data is the way that we are doing this. This is a trend we've been seeing over the past decades, the surveillance capitalistic trend, and it might have stayed out of the educational context, but for example, the COVID pandemic put it in an acceleration of including it also in the educational context. And these are the big questions that we need to talk about. And earlier this week, we also had, during dinner, we had this conversation about this topic. And I realized and noticed that I was quite frustrated about the topic, which my rant clearly showed. But I think the frustration is precisely what Claire is saying, is we're sleepwalking into this, and it will catch up with us. And the reality is that it moves way faster. You need to imagine that as we're moving into this age of AI, you have a bunch of semi-professionals, which are these AI agents that are relentless. They don't need rest, they don't tire. So they will catch up on us if we don't proactively start to design what are the safeguards we need in education. And that goes both ways, because in education, we don't only have a role as a teacher, but we also have a role as an employer. And in both these aspects, we need to be proactive of how are we going to include technology in this space where vulnerability is a big aspect of how it works.
So yeah, at dinner, I think you and Claire tried to convince all of us and wake us all up. And we were looking at you thinking, it sounds kind of scary, but we're not sure what to do with it. But maybe, we're not going to solve the big issue of the role of data and AI in our daily lives and in lives as children and education. But Claire, maybe what are some of the things that schools, for example, on a slightly more smaller scale could do to think more equitably about, or maybe there is no answer to this question, I don't know, or maybe even in showing some of these inequities without maybe solving the entire puzzle?
Again, I'm not quite sure what the situation is here in the Netherlands, but in the UK, a lot of schools now have data people. There are people employed to look after school data. And I think there is, from a lot of the education leaders that I've worked with, where I've shown them a lot of kind of UK data and the very firm government push towards the supporting the kind of education attainment of white working class children. Working class is a difficult signifier in and of that sense. What it is often taken to mean is a proxy for children who are entitled to sort of government-funded or supported school meals. But looking at some of that data, we do see that there are, Pakistani and Bengali and Black African Caribbean children that are actually entitled to free school meals at higher rates than white working class children. And so a lot of the leaders that I work with are always, in a way, quite surprised where you show them some of the larger and headline government data, because they're like, oh, well, we're understanding the problem of attainment and the kind of the gap talk and the gap gazing as being one that disproportionately impacts white working class children. And whilst there is absolutely a problem with the underachievement of white children, they're entitled to free school meals. There's not the only inequity, and there are actually other groups entitled to free school meals that also too underperform against their peers. But it's a strange justification for why we continue to have kind of focused groups and focused kind of governmental effort that isolates a group of children claiming or entitled to free school meals for particular help and support. And so I think those school leaders are often quite shocked and surprised where they see larger data. And actually, they have an enormous amount of data at their own disposal. And I know that when we do most of these sessions, a lot of them are like, well, I'm going to go home and look at our data. I'm going to look at our school data. I'm going to start asking critical questions of, admissions. I'm going to ask critical questions of, disciplinary, the allocations of behaviour points or achievement points, and actually to go back on just that level of the school, to really take a good critical look at the data points that they have and to reflect on their own practices and to look whether there are things that as individual schools that they could maybe point out as their strategic priorities for their children in those sort of communities. And I think that's the power of kind of just getting people to adopt a more critical understanding of data and to actually ask a different question, not to just accept it as a kind of, benign arrived in a vacuum number, but actually to connect them to processes that happen in the schools that they work. And I think, and it's the same, we speak to a lot of kind of researchers that are like, oh, I'm qual. I don't do quant. And actually, it's not about training statisticians. It's about training people to really critically engage with the numbers that exist in their surroundings, and to be able to, sorry, you were going to say so, to kind of really behave differently in and around number. And that can be done in your home, that can be done at the school, that can be done when you engage with constructions of problems that you read in the newspapers, that you hear in political discourse. I think these are really important skills, and you do not have to be a trained statistician or an economist to ask these questions. We do this in qualitative work. We trouble what we read as written artifact, but we don't take that same kind of critical gaze and apply it to the numbers. And so I think it's quite transformative at an individual level as well as schools and more structural and societal levels.
Yeah,
I see you nodding.
Yeah, I know. I this totally resonates with me. And this is also where part of my frustration comes, because some of these qualitative research, some end up in academia and do amazing work, but some also become policymakers and design the policy for education. And we just talked about like the role of evidence-based in policy. And if you don't know how to read and critically analyze those numbers, you are doing harm. And I'd like to add to that, to make it even the requirement even stronger. I think this necessity for, I don't have the proper word for it, but this necessity for proficiency or some form of proficiency around numbers, this is a necessity that has been there for decades. But now with the advent of AI, I think it's very important that we also get this algorithmic thinking proficiency or this computational thinking proficiency. And this is not restricted to the quantitative or technological scientists or engineers, but very much also to those policymakers. And one way of thinking that I love from the perspective of data ethics or philosophy of technology, it's attributed to this scholar Madeleine Acriche, who talks about the metaphor of the script. And so she tells us that every technology comes with a script, the engineer, the designer, and you can think about technology in a very broad sense. So it doesn't really have to be in the tech way that we think about it now. Any innovation, it comes with a script. The creator of it has a certain vision of how this innovation or technology is being used. But this script is not a static. This is something that evolves over time. And sometimes it also evolves in directions that the creator of it might not have seen beforehand. And one of these kind of algorithmic skills that I think needs to be essential in especially educational scholars is this grasp of this idea of the metaphor of the script. They need to be quick on their feet in identifying what is the original script of this technology or innovation, what is the current script, and what are some of the directions it could be heading. And this is exactly in situations where this is not clear is where you see that technology or innovation start to do harm.
So this is really a topic that I've seen also in academia more broadly, because I'm sometimes in very interdisciplinary spaces where we talk about different types of research proposals. And what I often notice is that as soon as we move a little bit away from the social sciences, people have ethics committees installed, but the researchers aren't necessarily in it. So it's like ethics is done by people who understand ethics and the people actually involved in creating either the technology or the ones actually dealing with the data do not seem to be engaging with the ethics themselves, right? So there seems to be a big separation between those two, as you also noticed, Khaled. I was wondering, though, Claire, with the what you said about the white working class students and how they have been sort of discovered as a potentially also marginalized group, which to a certain extent is true when it comes to poor white children in the UK as well. But the motivation to look beyond that, because I think we're now suggesting that if they know this and they recognize how data might be seen differently and used differently, that they also want to see this differently. But you also showed a lot of newspaper headlines in relation to the white working class boys marginalization trope. Can you reflect a little bit on that part of the storyline, right? Because knowing is one thing, but then...
Yeah. I mean, I think I've always taken quite a keen interest in what you might broadly consider to be the political construction of a problem, or at least what you can understand about a political construction of a problem. But then, in this rapidly connected world, you get the media as kind of almost interpreters of academic work. And a lot of this sits behind paywalls, and you're never really quite sure how some of the kind of, if you like, academic scholarship or conversations around academic ideas or theory end up within these sort of media as a sort of interpreter of this sort of work. So I do find that fascinating. But I think the media can be a powerful, if you like, conversationalist in the constructions of policy problems. And they become almost the way that public come to understand these problems. The public don't engage to a large extent in conversations around policies and problems and equity in education and these sorts of things. And as users of schools and as recipients of schoolings themselves, you often don't subject systems to the sort of scrutiny that you might do if you studied them. And so a lot of people come to rely on this media interpretations of policy problems. And I think that the difficulty with some of that and the kind of the quite myopic focus on the British government, at least, in looking at white working class children to the exclusion of other working class children. We have to keep reminding ourselves, actually, these are children who are not, this is not conflated with class, this is about eligibility for sort of free school meals, is, some scholars, to include David Goldborn, would describe that as a tacitly intentional feature of the system. It is not an accident. That it is entirely intentional, and it invisibilizes the large numbers of children, the much larger numbers of children, in fact, who are receiving free school meals from other of the British large ethnic groups and categories. And so I think, I'm not quite sure how we begin to re-socialize the media to get them to sort of refocus and to, again, take a far more critical understanding of kind of a conversation in and around the problem. And so as well as the call to action, if you like, for researchers to engage at this as a methodological challenge in our own work, I do think we have a social responsibility for trying to challenge some of these narratives and tropes, because they are absolutely playing into anti-immigration, sort of hate crime climate in what is already we were talking about this at the dinner the other day, what is already becoming an even more hostile space and even more difficult to have a conversation about the experiences of those that are racially minoritized in society. And so it becomes this kind of almost perfectly perpetuating system, and it's very difficult to interrupt. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try and do that.
Yeah. I love that you say that, especially also on the role of media. One of these thoughts that we've been playing around for the past 2 years is this idea And this is something that quantitative scientists have been saying for a while. There is so much data available. But we also realize that the availability of something is not the same as the accessibility of something. And I think in the context of science and what I hear you say, Claire, about the role of media therein is, to me, sounds like another instance of this idea. We have these amazing research being published and it's available, but it doesn't mean that it's accessible to the general public. And there, the media tries, harmfully or non-harmfully, tries to kind of democratize that access. But I think there is a larger responsibility also to scholars like you and if I can, like us, to also take that space, that vacuum that has been created in this kind of availability, accessibility gap. It's not just for media to take up that space, but definitely also for scholars. And I think it's mostly education where this will happen.
Yeah. And it's not just how we treat data and how we interpret them. But in the Netherlands, there's a very specific issue with the type of data that are even available, because nowhere do we record children's ethnic racial identification. And we know race is a social construct with very real social consequences. But even self-identification, would they be racialized as a black or brown person, for example? All we have in the Netherlands is whether children have a migration background, meaning that either they or their parents were born in another country. And if that's a quote-unquote non-Western country, then it's sort of used as a proxy potentially for children of color. But there's so many children out there who would not qualify according to those standards in that category, but who would be racialized as brown or black by teachers, by society. And we're losing all of those in the Netherlands. So it's also that data availability that will dictate the lens through which we look, right?
So I think that's a two-edged sword. The lack of this data and wanting to have this data. And you and I were part of a advisory committee that one of the kind of objectives we had was also investigate the role of data on these topics. And
the report will come out very soon, by the way, about how to collect ethnic racial data in an ethical way for social justice purposes without the dangers that we know are there, and is the original reason why we don't at least centrally register it.
Super interested, so definitely send me a copy because I'm not part of the advisory committee anymore. But where I was heading at was 3 years, 4 years, 5 years ago. I have no clue how long it is ago. But back then, I think I would have agreed with the statement, we need to collect that data. Now, if you ask me, I think this is a very, and I'm looking for the right words, but it's a very regressive approach to it. And what I mean with the regressive is it's kind of the regression kind of statistics where you need this for. Whereas if we agree on the fact that maybe there now is a necessity for this more qualitative aspect of kind of doing stuff mathematically or statistically, I'm not sure that's a paradox there or not. I start to wonder whether you want to collect that data or whether you want to trust kind of the process of finding these qualitative aspects without giving it this data. And that might even be interesting because it will tell you what are these confounding variables that maybe define or dictate the discrepancy in distribution of welfare or opportunities or whatever aspect you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Claire, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I wrestle with this, and in the end, I think I come to the position that data becomes a necessary evil. I think to not have almost enables the kind of hegemonic norms and mores to just remain, and so for me, numbers become quite a powerful way to interrupt some of those discourses and understandings. However, numbers have great histories of doing great harm to many communities. And so I'm not quite sure what the answer is to that. I think it comes back to that really robust understanding of what you're doing and for whom and for why, and to be very, very careful about the kind of conversation that you have off the back of it. But I think I would still advocate for a position where data remains available to public scrutiny and available in and of that self. In terms of self-identification, I think that's really important in an ever-increasingly, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multiracial space. I'm not sure we'd ever make it inroads into kind of reclassifying census data, but I think at some point, as societies change, it's really important to think about how we begin to capture data about people's racial and ethnic backgrounds for social justice ends. And I think, that kind of changes. In the UK, we have sort of 7 major ethnic groups, but then we have minor groups as well. I was reading some interesting work about the US perhaps removing ethnicity from their census from 2030. And again, as a kind of critical scholar, I'm really interested into understanding why and what the logics were from removing ethnic categories from census data. And so I think, again, CRT would say that these kind of categories are not natural. These kind of categorizing people by different groupings, be it racial or ethnic or religious or linguistic or sexual, these sorts of things. They're not natural in and of themselves. But I still believe they're some of the biggest tools that we have to kind of, fight towards greater equity for those that are marginalised. And if we didn't have it, would become further marginalised.
And of course, in addition, CRT would also argue that quote unquote color blindness does not advance racial equity and some color consciousness. So that at least means knowing who's where and why they are there and not in other places within an education system, within tracks, within opportunities is also crucial, right? Yeah. So what would you say, Khaled, to people working in education or policymakers? Which ones would you like to target? Which audience would you like to target when you give your wisdom in terms of the role of data, technology, and racial fairness?
I think the real impact makers in education are probably the educators themselves. But I think it all starts down with, or it needs to start down with policy and then trickle down or percolate through the rest of the industry. And I would mostly try and tell policymakers that this allergy, and this is the frustration that I found in my company on this allergy that you see in qualitative sciences for tech or quantitative stuff is doing harm. And so I'd like to challenge them to start thinking about the role of a scientist in society in a more broader perspective. You mentioned this thesis of some scholar about the concept of Bildung. This is something I've been walking around with years, and I also taught a course about this at the University of Amsterdam. The idea that we need to raise all-rounded academics that are socially impactful intellectuals in society, and I think critical thinking is a big part of that. And nowadays, algorithmic thinking or computational thinking, number proficiency are highly necessary aspects of critical thinking.
And that includes, because that also came up this week, that a lot of us feel that the responsibility doesn't only lie with policymakers, but also with us who teach in higher education, because a lot of us teach future teachers.
Exactly.
Right. Claire, who would you like to address, if you will, and what would your message be?
Dear me. Who would I like to address? I think at the heart of most of what I do is just trying to challenge policy understandings of problems. I think that's where I see my contribution. I think contributions at all levels are really, really important. I just think most of my work has worked towards, because I'm interested in administrative data, naturally fits towards speaking towards the kind of policy audience, if you like. With the hope, perhaps, maybe too ideological, but with the hopes that if you can begin to socialise a different narrative, if you can begin to challenge understandings of policy problems, that you may then be able to begin that kind of more of a top-down approach to, at least how the problem is understood and communicated, and the work that governments commission or don't commission to be slightly more, if you like, sociologically minded. I remember we were talking about this again in terms of what would we like to be, and in the end, I guess I'd like to be a bit of a thorn in the side of those that are in control of the education system, because it's one of those systems that every child, by virtue of human rights, should be involved in, and it is such a unique captive space on a week-to-week basis that actually schools are really powerful places for children. And for those that don't see themselves as fitting, for those that see themselves as being, minoritized in or excluded in, those things can be really detrimental to future outcomes across, whether it's, health or wealth or all of those different things. And I think that for me, policy is where I start. But there are also incredible teachers that are actually trying to do this from the ground up. And I think that actually attacking the system in a way at all levels will lead to the best outcomes. I see myself as speaking to policy. But as I said, in our teaching, I teach school leaders. I teach young undergraduate students who, for some, it's the first time they've ever been introduced to some of these ideas. And some of them feel a little bit cheated by ideas of national curriculum because it hasn't allowed them to ask these questions. It hasn't allowed them to develop the kind of criticality. And most school systems are geared towards a canon of knowledge and a particular type of performance against some nationally mandated marking scheme. And in the end, we don't want them to argue with that. We don't want them to critically engage with that. We don't want them to adopt a different position and defend the position that they're adopting. And so you get these young undergraduates that have kind of well-schooled, and they're very intelligent, very bright, but in the end they perform marking schemes. And I think that it is the responsibility of everybody. And again, I think higher ed, in particularly those that are going to work with the future policymakers, future educators, and future different people that occupy various different sort of social groups and organisations and, social services and all the different sort of public institutions that our young people end up occupying. I just think it's really important that we continue to access this from multiple different ways, but also collectively. And I think in this highly individualised world where we work increasingly in silos, schooling just seems to be set aside from other public institutions. I don't know that that's helpful. We need to go back to thinking about public institutions as a collective and not looking at education as a silo to housing, as a silo to health, as a silo to, poverty or deprivation or, environmental concerns. We need to start somewhere where we can start to bring a lot of these things together because education is a microcosm of other inequities that we see in society, but it seems to be one of the first places that we can begin to disrupt that. My appeal would be greater systems thinking.
Yes, and a lot of collaboration between people, knowing different fields, knowing different disciplines. I was raised academically in a very positivist, data-driven way. And in the last, 10, 15 years, my eyes have been opened by working together with people from so many different disciplines, looking at the role of data and other ways of knowing towards a social justice goal. And I have found it incredibly enriching, as I have found talking to both of you about this topic. So thank you very much for being here and contributing today.
Thank you too, Judy.
Thank you so much.